Voice of the Sea, learning from experts across the ocean. Welcome to Voice of the Sea. In this episode, we design and build a large-scale science experiment. We'll follow along as scientists plan and prepare a long-term ecological study of Moorea's coral reef. University of California at Santa Barbara researchers Andy Brooks, Rush Schmidt, and Sally Holbrook have been studying the coral reef community, looking at interactions between coral, algae, and fish for almost 30 years. Their recent work has had surprising results, suggesting that corals can protect themselves from algae by growing in groups. This research has tremendous implications for management of coral reefs, as we try to keep an adequate balance of coral and fish abundance in the face of climate change and increasing environmental and fishing pressure.
You know, this experiment really came out of this experiment that we had done previously, where we were actually wrong in what we thought was going to happen. We really thought that if we excluded herbivores from having access to a tile like this that had coral growing on it, that the algae would quickly grow up and overgrow the corals, smother them out, and we would just have a big fuzzy plate of algae and dead coral. And that's 180 degrees opposite of what we found. The coral that were in our full cages that had no access by herbivores or fish that actually consume coral did the best. There was no algae at all on those tiles, or very, very little algae compared to some of the other ones. It's like, well, okay, that wasn't supposed to happen. And so there have been other studies that have shown that corals may actually produce some chemicals that function as algicides, which sort of makes sense, right?
Right.
And so this experiment is really meant to test that hypothesis that coral may actually be able to control or at least influence the growth of macroalgae nearby. And where this experiment can inform managers is it may be that there's a critical density of coral. It's not each individual coral, it's only when there are enough corals that they're all producing this substance that it actually can take an effect. And so by having some of these tiles with just a single coral versus others with 4 corals, we can test that question of, is one coral really enough? Can it protect itself, or does it need to be in a neighborhood of other corals? And of course, if it needs to be in a neighborhood of other corals, then that tells managers there's a critical threshold. And if the density of coral on a reef falls below that critical threshold, coral may not be able to stop algae from overgrowing it and sort of taking over all the space on the reef. And so that's a critically important piece of information for managers to have. We're actually doing 2 experiments in one. With this particular experiment, we're asking 2 questions at the same time. One is, what is the effect of the coral on the algae? And then the other one is, what is the effect of herbivorous and corallivorous fishes on corals? Because of course we'll have some corals in cages without any access by the fish, and we'll have some that are open. And so we're actually looking at 2 things with one experiment. And then some of the other questions that we're asking are really more pure research questions about how coral and macroalgae interact and how reefs can recover from disturbance and not go to a state where they're dominated by macroalgae. And some of that will ultimately, hopefully, have management implications as well, but they're not as direct as, for instance, is there this density of coral that's required to maintain some type of control over algal growth. The other part of this is, because we're really interested in how the spatial arrangement of the corals and the sort of amount of coral tissue might impact algal growth, we need something to take the place of coral if we don't have all 4 positions on our tile occupied. And so our dummy coral is just going to be a white marble. So it's glass, it's inert, it shouldn't release any compounds that might affect the growth of the algae, and yet it takes up the space, and it's about the same size as the little piece of coral that we'll put on there. So we have 500 marbles that we have to now start gluing onto the tiles.
But the algae could grow on the marble.
Yeah, the algae could grow on the marble.
It's basically 2 themes that we try to explore. The one is sort of a shorter time frame where we're trying to understand the ecological processes that confer resilience to the coral. So when it gets disturbed, what are the ecological processes that return it to the coral state? The second theme deals with the longer time frame, which is these environmental changes that are occurring over longer time frames, like the ocean is warming, it's becoming more acidic, sea levels rising. And so we want to know both how that's going to affect the resilience of the reef, that is the ability to recover from disturbances that will continue to happen, but also how those changes itself are going to affect the composition of the coral community, what it's going to be like. And so we have a series of projects that we've been doing to sort of tackle these various things, and we're finding all kinds of really interesting and important ecological processes, that some of which were known before and some of which are new. And so that's really sort of the basis for what we've been doing.
So we've done experiments where we've caged tiles and put them on the fore reef and let algae grow. And the purpose of those experiments, or at least one of them, was to ask, if we reduce the amount of herbivory on the reef, will we see algae growing? So we had a design of cages where they stepped down in limiting access of these herbivorous fish to the tiles that were inside the cages. So they ranged from full access to basically no access by fish, by the herbivorous fish. And we were asking, how much could we reduce the foraging intensity of these herbivores on this reef here? So one thing about this experiment that'll be very interesting is this effect of how dense corals need to be when they settle as young juvenile animals to suppress growth. In this case, we're thinking growth of algae.
So our cages actually had different size holes in it, and we actually know from baiting them what the grazing intensity, what kind of fish get in there and how often they get in there, how big they are. And so we have this really nice gradient of grazing pressure that we can create from open, so ambient, down to very, very reduced. That almost nothing would be able to get
in
that
this.
cage.
I see.
And so by having larger and larger hole sizes, we gave access to different kinds of numbers of fish grazers. And so we created this grazing intensity experiment. And our hypothesis, as Sally was saying, was that at intermediate grazing is where you'd have the best coral performance, because it's a trade-off between suppressing the macroalgae but not getting nibbled on too much, right? Wasn't the case. Actually, the corals grew the best when they were completely protected.
Wow.
And so that's a really unexpected finding.
not what we thought.
And we also know, though, at the same time, we had cages like this out with tiles that did not have coral, and algae grew really well on those tiles. So without the little corals, the algae did great in these cages, because most of the fish, like parrotfish, surgeonfish, those things can't get in to nibble on any algae that's growing on tiles.
How densely did you have corals stacked on your
That's
tile?
exactly the right question. So what we're doing in this experiment was actually testing that new hypothesis now about, is there neighborhood suppression? At what density do you have to be, if there is, to get that neighborhood effect? And so what we're doing now in these complete cages is we're keeping all the grazers out, so we expect that's the opportunity for algae to grow. So we'll have tiles with no corals on it, so that'll tell us how much algae grows, right? Then we'll have tiles with 1 coral on it, 2 corals on it, and 4 corals on it. And that will tell us, is there a density at which you start suppressing algae in the neighborhood? And if it's some sort of threshold effect, it tells you at what density coral has to settle out there for it to actually defeat in the neighborhood a competitor.
In our other experiment, we had 4 corals per tile.
Yes,
And
that's the
so
maximum
there was
density.
1 in each corner. And they started out very, very small. They were about a ½ an inch in diameter, really small baby corals. And then over the 2 years, they grew to almost completely fill the tile. They were almost touching
It was amazing.
each other in just 2 years.
The University of Hawaii's Sea Grant College program focused on Hawaii's coasts and its communities through sustainable development, safe seafood supply, sustainable coastal tourism, hazard resilience, and healthy coastal ecosystems. Hawaii's Sea Grant.
Welcome back. We're in the wet labs at the Gump Research Station with researcher Andy Brooks, learning how they prepare tiles for his experiment. The tiles are ceramic with physical properties that mimic dead coral. We catch up with Andy as he's preparing tiles that have been soaking in seawater. And now these have been soaking under the dock.
So these have been soaking under the dock for about a year.
Oh, I thought they was just for a few days.
No, it takes, we like to soak them for at least 3 to 4 months. 6 months is pretty usual, and these have just been under there for a year. We can reuse these over and over and over again. So these were ones that had been used in another experiment. They've been cleaned off and then put back under the dock.
Why do you need to soak them if they've already been used once?
Because once they dry out, it sort of kills off this red crustose coral and algae that's growing on here. And we like to have sort of a living coat of that actually on the tile. And so what we're going to do is we're going to sort of, with a wire brush, we're just going to go over the surface to get sediment and any loose sort of fouling organisms that have been on there. But we're really not going to scrub it hard enough to take that red crustose coral and algae off.
And you like to have the living coat so that it more closely
Resembles the surface of the reef.
Can you explain to me what a crustose coral and algae is?
Yeah, so it's actually an algae, but it forms sort of a hard surface out of calcium carbonate, the same stuff that coral uses. And so it's really a deterrent against herbivores coming and eating it. It's made itself hard and crunchy and unpalatable. But it's also used by a lot of corals as a settlement cue. It gives off an odor, and some corals can sense that odor, and they use it as a signal that, you know, this is a bare area of reef and it's an appropriate substrate for me to settle out on.
So when you're transplanting the little tiny corals onto this, it sort of makes them feel at home.
Yeah. So we have 80 cages right now. We have 40 that are going to be our treatment cages, the cages where we're going to exclude all of the herbivores from being able to access the tile and the corals inside. And then we need 40 more for the controls that we have that are open, and they're actually going to allow access by the herbivores. So we need 80 of these all together. I think we probably have 85 or 90 together in these two water tables. So once we get these scrubbed up and cleaned up, we'll go on to the next phase, which is actually to figure out how we're going to glue our little marbles on here. And our marbles are sort of coral mimics. They don't have any living coral tissue. They're just inert glass balls, but they'll take up the same space as our coral will, and they'll hopefully alter the water flow moving around on the surface of the tile just as a coral would if a coral was there. So we'll glue all the marbles on in their respective positions. Some tiles will have 4 marbles, no coral at all, and so that's a tile that we expect to have a lot of algae on it if it's in a full cage. If it's in an open cage, we actually expect it not to have any, because of course the herbivores will come in and clean it. And then other tiles will have either 3 marbles, 2 marbles, or 1 marble. Once we have all the marbles on, then we'll actually go out and we'll get the coral. And we want the coral to be in the lab for as little time as possible. If we can do it just overnight, that's the best. So we'll go out first thing in the morning, we'll collect the corals, we'll bring them in, we'll have a huge group of people attaching the corals to the plates, measuring the coral, collecting all the data. They'll go then into the cages with the bolts. The cage will get sealed up. They'll go into these big blue tanks of water. This marine epoxy that we use actually works underwater.
Oh, wow.
That's the best part about it.
So you can take it out onto the reef.
Yeah, so we actually take it down and use it underwater. But it dries more slowly underwater. And so what we like to do is actually use the rough surface of the tile, just because it gives something for the epoxy to stick to. And I'm going to make a little blob. This is much more than we would use for a coral, but I'm going to just push the marble in there. And my thinking is that if I get this higher than the middle of the marble, it should stick. It's getting really sticky.
So could you do this in the water table?
Yeah, so this is actually, I think, maybe what we ought to do is move to the water table. I think it's going to be a little bit easier to do it. So the marble is really supposed to be our coral mimic. And so if we were to cover the marble completely with epoxy, or almost all of it, then we would actually have to cover the coral to the same degree. And since we're trying to cover as little area of the living coral as possible, we need to leave an equal amount of area of the marble showing, so that it really is as equivalent as we can make it to what we're trying to do with the coral. So see, that's great. That's much
like,
better than any of these.
That was like the same size as the marble, about, I think.
Yeah. And so if we could get away with something like that, that would be wonderful. We don't scrape the entire surface of the tile when it actually comes time to evaluate the experiment. We actually have a piece of plastic that we cut squares. The squares are a square centimeter, 1 centimeter on each side, and they're randomly placed on that piece of plastic. And then that fits over our tile and serves as a template. And then we remove everything within that exposed square, so that we're always taking a standardized amount of area and how much material was growing on that standard unit.
And then you analyze that.
And then we analyze that.
So you basically subsample your tile.
Exactly. And so if possible, we try to get multiple samples, multiple subsamples off of the tile. Then that material is identified, either visually, or sometimes we have to use a microscope to see some of the smaller structures. But we identify the material that's on the tile, and then it's weighed. We get a wet weight. Then it's put in a drying oven, and it's dried for a couple of days to a constant weight. And then it's put in a muffle furnace and actually ashed. And what that does is it removes all the organic material, and then it's re-weighed after that. And that gives us the sort of amount of organic material per square centimeter of area sampled on the tile. And that becomes the thing that we really use to make the comparison between the treatments.
Exploring Our Fluid Earth is the dynamic curriculum developed by the University of Hawaii's Curriculum Research and Development Group. The award-winning Fluid Earth and Living Ocean textbooks are now interactive and online. New activities, updated content, and a teacher community. Exploring Our Fluid Earth is now freely available. Find out more at exploringourfluidearth.org. Welcome back to the Gump Research Station on the island of Moorea in French Polynesia. Andy, Sally, and Russ show us how they set up their coral and algae experiment in the field, and we learn about some of the early results.
How you deploy this is we drill on the forereef, which is really hard rock, right? Hard substance. And we put in stainless steel all-thread posts. And then this is the bottom structure, and it's put down, the posts come up through the edges of this, through the holes. And then we anchor this on that, and it makes a very secure thing, because this cage can't bend very much, and you get a really stable platform out there.
How long does it take you to anchor one of the
To put one down, the whole process from the time you drill the small holes into the reef, and these holes are only 1/4 of an inch, they're very small. We drill the holes, we put the stainless steel poles in, or sometimes we put in small stainless steel eye bolts. It takes, yeah, it takes, we'll go out and drill 30 or 40 holes in a day, and then we epoxy them in with a marine epoxy. You have to wait a day for that to dry. And then to actually, once those are in place, it's really quick to put these on. They simply slide down over the poles, a couple of cable ties to hold them on, and then another couple of cable ties from the corner down to the eye bolts, and you're done. So about 5 minutes to actually physically install it, but 2 or 3 days to get it all prepped for that to happen.
And how do you decide where on the reef you're going to place them?
That's a really good question. In part, we want to make sure that we're working in an area where we've seen a lot of natural coral recruits, so we know we're in an area that we think coral will perform well. We also have to bear in mind just safety and how long our divers can stay down. We try not to work deeper than, say, 30 or 40 feet, about 10 meters, unless there's a real strong ecological reason for why something needs to be done deeper. That gives us enough bottom time to get a fair amount of work done without having to worry about going into decompression diving or anything like that.
We have it also that if you want to photograph the experiment by divers in the middle of it, you don't have to bring it in because this top is just cable tied on, just like a shoebox, right? And the diver can go out and cut the cable ties, take a photo, make measurements, look in there, do whatever, and then put this top back on. And so the whole thing can stay in the field, and it's really easy to get these tops on and off by divers underwater.
How long will you leave these settlement plates out?
Well, probably 1 to 2 years. It will take a minimum of a year, probably, we think, to get much algal growth. And the species of algae, especially the larger bodied species that are slower to reproduce and get established out there. So definitely a year, maybe up to 2 years.
After 2 years of the experiment, their results show that corals living together in relatively high density can prevent growth of macroalgae on the reef. This is important evidence of a positive feedback loop that helps keep populations of coral healthy.
The Curriculum Research and Development Group in the College of Education at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. CRDG's training roots go back over 40 years. Through professional development programs, curriculum workshops, research on teaching methodology, individualized school and district training, and so much more. The Curriculum Research and Development Group, improving schools, improving education. CRDG.
Turn your love of the ocean into a lifelong career. Join NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as we unlock the secrets in the deep oceans, track rapidly moving storms, model climate trends, protect and preserve our marine resources, and so much more. It's all in a day's work at NOAA. Find a career that makes a world of difference, enriching life through science, service, and stewardship. NOAA.
Healthy oceans are critical to our cultural, economic, and environmental sustainability in Hawaii. The ocean serves as a source of water, food, medicine, jobs, transportation, recreation, and energy. It controls climate and weather. Kosi Island Earth aims to share this ocean awareness by partnering with local scientists and educators to engage communities and schools in active science learning for an ocean-literate population. Kosi Island Earth is working to establish new avenues for connecting research scientists with educators and communities. Kosi Island Earth is enhancing the science and ocean literacy of our island residents and visitors. Kosi Island Earth is connecting scientific research, traditional knowledge, and ocean policy. Kosi Island Earth, bringing together university, government, research, and community partners to improve science education and ocean stewardship in Hawaii.